Hey, how's everybody doing? Hoping you're having a fantastic day. So, today we're going to be going over another section of St. Thomas's commentary on the Lord's Prayer. This is going to be our last section. And as a reminder, next week we will be going over, actually, we might be going over next week the entire exposition of the angelic salutations of St. Thomas's commentary on the Ave, but I might have something coming up the end of next week. I'll just make sure I let you guys know, but just prepare to read the whole thing. It's not that long, so you guys should be fine. It'll help you. I've been giving you guys all of these really easy short sections to read so you can contemplatively read, but I'm gonna, I guess, stretch you guys a little bit for next week. So the three petitions we're going to be going over today are going to be: forgive us our trespass, we forgive those who trespass against us, lead us not into temptation, and then deliver us from evil. So first and that's, I'm going to just call them the fifth, sixth, and seventh petition, so don't get confused by what I mean by the fifth, sixth, and seventh petition. Fifth is about trespasses, sixth about temptation, seventh is about evil. So don't mix them up, because then it could get a bit confusing. So if you remember, St. Thomas has been doing this thing where he is connecting the petitions of the Lord's Prayer with the gifts of the Holy Ghost. Unfortunately, I have still not been able to find a chart that connects these two for us to give you guys a visual. But if anybody knows about that, please do send that to me. So the next petition, so forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, he's going to connect this with the gift of counsel, because the gift of counsel for St. Thomas, at least here, is going to direct us in the way of mortification. So in the way of following the life of the commandments, if you want to put it like that. So what the gift of counsel is going to do is the gift of counsel is going to help us rise from our sins, whether deliberate venial sins or after an act of contrition, after a mortal sin. So this is what the gift of counsel is going to do. So the gift of counsel leads us to ask for the forgiveness of our trespasses, which is going to be something which forms humility, as we're going to see. So what the trespass is, and this is very interesting. I love what St. Thomas does here, because this really does just show his very deep penetration into the spiritual life. So St. Thomas, he's going to define these trespasses as the preferring of our will to the will of God. Now, why is this so good? So when you look at the spiritual writers are going to have, in the sort of way of the beginners, are two, well, throughout the whole spiritual life, there's kind of a dual movement that's going on. There's going to be first the need for prayer, which is going to be communion with God, recognizing God's greatness. And then there's going to be the need for mortification, which is recognizing our own sin. And fundamentally, mortification is not preferring our own will. This is what St. Therese was so good at, not preferring her own will, is the sort of contradicting of will becomes the foundation for mortification. So for St. Thomas, the way in which he's describing sin is he's describing sin as a transgression of the commandment that we are asking for forgiveness from. So forgive us our trespasses really is the cry of somebody who is in the purgative way. It's somebody who really is at least focusing on active purgation. They're focusing on contradicting their own will and conforming it unto the will of God, not being attached to their own will. So this is why this is so important. So he considers three aspects of this petition. So first, he's going to ask, why do we make this petition? And he's going to give two reasons for this. So the first reason is that we need to ever be in a state of salutary fear and humility. So a state of salutary fear and humility. This is going to really regard our approaching, if you want to put it like that, our approaching of sin. To constantly ask God for the forgiveness of our trespasses is to recognize that even in the most devout soul on earth right now, let's keep it that, the most devout soul, obviously we're excluding the Blessed Virgin Mary when it comes to this statement, but even the most devout soul is going to have at least certain antecedent movements which are not going to be under the control of their reason or even the implicit command of their will. And that's going to be some sort of concupiscence. And these are the fomes peccati. These are the tinders of sin or the flame of sin. So even the most devout soul is going to be somebody who has a disordered soul. And therefore, every single soul, every single person can petition for the forgiveness of trespasses. So this puts us in humility because we recognize that we need to ask for forgiveness of our trespasses, but also puts us in fear because we're going to be looking ahead and being careful as not to let those tinders of sin or let that fuel of sin flame forth into deliberate venial sin or even mortal sin. And then another reason for this, St. Thomas is going to state this very beautifully, but he's going to say another reason for this is that we live in hope. There's a very, very good book. Where is it on my shelf? Here it is. We don't even have my camera on, so it doesn't even matter. But it's The Spiritual Combat, and it's by Scopoli. And this is basically I guess you could say this is the classic text on mortification. You can get something like Scopoli, not Scopoli, not Scopolti, Scopoli, something like that, plus the catechismal mental prayer that'll get you everything you need to know. They're fantastic, but it's a classical treatise on mortification, and really it says we can view whether we have that true salutary fear and humility, whether we have a true view of God's goodness and of our own evil, by how we respond to our fall into sin. The sin that truly is humble and truly has salutary fear, that soul is not going to be surprised by the fact that they have fallen into sin. They're going to feel contrite for it, obviously, but they're not going to be surprised. And the response is going to turn in hope to God and to say, forgive us our trespasses. Living always in hope of the divine mercy. But somebody who does think that they are somehow good, somebody who does underestimate the mercy of God, does not properly recognize his goodness, that person is going to respond by getting all bitter and angry and running to their spiritual director to try to excuse themselves. But the devout soul does not respond in that way. So this petition really is the sort of expression of purgative way. Forgive us our trespasses. So second, how is this fulfilled? So he says that the sin that we fall into is taken away in contrition. And it's not only just any sort of contrition, but with the desire to, in the purpose to go to confession as soon as possible and to make satisfaction for that sin. So he says that one has no need to fear then, because for the remission of a fault, contrition with purpose to confess is sufficient. So for those of you who are catechumens out there, I'll get this actually quite frequently. Unfortunately, nobody's taught them this, but they'll have this anxiety about the fact that they can't confess. And this anxiety is basically the fact that they're sinning. Obviously, it would be very odd if they weren't at least committing deliberate venial sins in this state. They're sinning, but they don't have access to the sacrament of confession. That's the struggle that they have. So they become very stressed, very anxious. But we need to recognize is contrition with the purpose to confess and make satisfaction, even if that confession is going to be in the future. That's going to be sufficient for your forgiveness before God. But this is going to lead to the question, naturally, why then do we even go to confession if contrition is enough? Why do we even need to do it? So St. Thomas answers it right here in a very glorious way. So I'm just going to read this actually. If sin is thus taken away when a man is contrite, of what necessity is the priest? To this it must be said that God does forgive the sin in contrition, and eternal punishment is changed to temporal. But nevertheless, the debt of temporal punishment remains. So if you ever learned about the distinction between eternal and temporal punishment, you need to look in your catechism. What section would that be? Just read on the sacrament of penance in your catechism. Just read that. But the reason that we go to confession anyways is because there's still the temporal punishment due to sin. He says, and eternal punishment is changed to temporal, but nevertheless, the debt of temporal punishment remains. If one should die without confession, not out of contempt for it, but prevented from it, one would go to purgatory, where the punishment, as St. Augustine says, is very great. When you confess, the priest absolves you of this punishment in virtue of the keys to which you subject yourself in confession. And therefore Christ says the apostles receive the Holy Spirit, whose sins you forgive are forgiven then, and whose sins you retain are retained. When therefore one is confessed, something of this punishment is taken away. And similarly, when he has again confessed, it could be that after he has confessed many times, all would be remitted. So this last statement right here is also important for the way in which we think about confession in the purgative way. So, and then Father Lagrange actually talks about this in his 3 Ages at quite a length. So, rather than treating confession as something occasional that you do because you've fallen into mortal sin, so let's say that would, and then you obviously have your yearly confession that you have to do. Instead of that, the traditional advice is to have a fixed time. For example, weekly, every other week. Those are traditional numbers to have. Even if you haven't committed any mortal sins, and you've only committed deliberate venial sins. But why is this? Well, because what he says here is he says that actually when you confess, even when you confess a sin and your contrition is a bit weaker, that's going to remove less of the temporal punishment. So there's still temporal punishment that's going to be left over for your sins. So you can actually, as long as this is not out of scrupulosity, so be very careful that this is not out of scrupulosity, you can actually take that same sin to confession after you've already confessed it. And just make sure you are careful to state this. And then also venial sins are going to come with some sort of temporal punishment. So making sure you mention them is very important. So that's why that is a traditional practice. And that's what St. Thomas is saying here. St. Thomas is talking about confessing the same sin many times. St. Thomas actually went to confession daily. If you can, more power to you. But obviously 99.9% of you guys, unless you happen to have one of those unicorn parishes with daily confession right before daily mass, then you're probably not going to be able to do that. But yeah, that was what St. Thomas did. And then he also goes on to indulgences, by which this is also done. So this is, I guess, another tip that, from me to you is that look up about indulgences and the way in which indulgences are able to help with the remission of the temporal punishments due to your sin. Even something like reading scripture is going to be able to get an indulgence. And then there's certain rules which are attached to it as well, such as praying for the Pope, going to confession, receiving the sacrament, doing the work, and so on. So definitely make sure you also look into those if you're actually, you should look into those. Not if you're so inclined, you should look into those if you don't know about them. Okay, so, and then he goes on to ask what is required on our part. And what's required on our part is the forgiveness of the offenses which our neighbor commits against us. And that's why he says, as we forgive those who trespass against us, in the prayer. Okay, now on to the 6th petition. So the sixth petition adds to the last one by adding freedom from the commission of future sins rather than merely the forgiveness of past ones. Because really, this is the twofold focus of purgation is going to be purging your former sins. That is the mortal sins, the deliberate venial sins, and even imperfections that you commit. And then this is for the purpose of something future. Not only are you receiving forgiveness in this sort of like abstract way, but also you're going to be guarding yourself against committing future sins. So this is what the lead us not into temptation means, is a prayer against the commissioning of future sins. So he's going to ask three questions about this. He's going to look at temptation under three rationes, if you may. So the first, he's going to ask, what is temptation? So broadly speaking, temptation is going to be about the testing or the trying of one's virtue. And this is going to be either in doing good or in avoiding evil. So testing our virtue and doing good is basically going to be certain trials that we're going to suffer through that are going to strengthen us towards the practicing of good. So you might go through a difficult portion in your life, and even in this difficult time, you're going to still practice virtue. This is basically the whole book of Job right here. And under this aspect, we can actually say that God tests or God tempts people, if we're talking about under the aspect of doing good. Because God definitely sends trials to those who he loves. And why does he send trials to those who he loves? Because sometimes, you got to let your kids touch the stove, and once they touch the stove, they'll never do it again. It's like my son Augustine. He a few weeks ago, he tried to climb out of his crib. He climbed out of his crib and he fell out because it was getting a little bit too short for him. And you know what? After he did that one time, he never had to try again. Why? Because through suffering, we learn a lot of times. In a good, as it says in the book of Hebrews, a good father is somebody who is going to discipline his children. And in this way, God is disciplining or trying or testing us towards goodness. And the other way, the usual way in which we think of temptation, is the temptation against avoiding evil. And the temptation against avoiding evil is when we propose certain evils to somebody else. So this will be like if somebody, tried to seduce somebody else. This would be against avoiding evil. And in this way, obviously, you can't tempt somebody in this way without sin, without committing positively an evil. So obviously, in this way, God does not tempt anyone. So what are the three ways in which we are tempted? So it says in John's first epistle, it already tells us. So it's going to be the flesh, the devil, and the world. And I know it's the world, the flesh, and the devil in John, but I don't know. It kind of actually annoyed me that St. Thomas outlined it differently, but it is what it is. So how are we tempted by our flesh? So the flesh incites one to evil through seeking its own carnal pleasures. And this isn't necessarily actually inciting us to mortal sin. This is also inciting us to venial sin and then certain imperfections, which imperfection is going to include any time in which the lower faculties act against the higher faculties or not even under their command. So it's in this way that the flesh is going to incite one to evil. And then secondly, the flesh can tempt us by enticing us away from the good. And this is going to basically be the flesh putting obstacles in the way of the spirit. So this is why you get, under this aspect, you'll get people who are doing good in spite of various bodily limitations. So for example, somebody who fasting is actually a great example of this. Is fasting, we are both under the first aspect, actually, we're stopping the flesh from inciting us to mortal sin by even stopping the flesh from inciting us to imperfections. So by restraining imperfections, that is the sort of antecedent desire to eat food, which is not controlled by our reason, by even stopping that, we're going to be disciplining our flesh against the more difficult things. But also it's going to overcome the enticing of us away from the good, so we can more easily practice the good. This is from our flesh. And then second, it's from the devil. And St. Thomas has a really good analysis of this. So I'm just going to read it actually. So he's going to say, the devil tempts us with extreme force. Even when the flesh is subdued, another tempter arises, namely the devil, against whom we have a heavy struggle. The devil proceeds most cunningly in tempting us. He operates like a skilled general when about to attack a fortified city. He looks for the weak places in the object of his assaults. And in that part where a man is most weak, he tempts him. He tempts man in those sins to which, after subduing the flesh, he is most inclined. Those are, for instance, our anger, pride, and other spiritual sins. So actually, if you want to read about this, because often what happens in the spiritual life, and I guess this is why St. Thomas organized it in this way, what happens is after you have overcome the discordance between the lower and higher faculties, so this is going to happen, it's basically going to happen during the first book of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, basically the purgative way, where you are bringing under the subduance your lower faculties to your higher faculties by the way of contradiction of the will against sensual pleasures. So in this, after this happens, you're going to have certain what St. John of the Cross is going to call, and then if you want to read about this in very much, if you want to read about this in a lot of detail, you can read first book of Dark Night of the Soul. I think it's first book of the Dark Night of the Soul that he talks about this. It's one, it's right at the beginning. So he's going to say that, once you start actually contradicting sensual pleasures, you're going to have other sort of spiritualized carnal pleasures that you're going to deal with. And this is going to be things like spiritual pride, spiritual anger, spiritual envy, spiritual gluttony, where your good desires towards spirituality are going to turn themselves into vices because of how cunning the devil is when he realizes that you have overcome the weaknesses of your flesh. So he's going to go on. The devil does two things when he tempts us. Thus, he does not at once suggest something that appears to us as evil, but something that has a semblance of good. And then this is going to be basically what we can meditate on the temptation of Eve. So the temptation of Eve, there wasn't something which was evil immediately presented before her. No, it was something which was good to the eyes. Something which actually doesn't seem like from the narrative that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is something that would be separated from man forever. It seems like eventually they would have partaken of it. Maybe that would have been something which would have transformed them, kind of like how death is for us. It would have transformed them from the state of grace to the state of glory. Would have brought them to the beatific vision. So it's something which wasn't exactly bad. It had the semblance of good, but under the aspect of temptation, that is before God told them they were allowed to take of it, something which is, while a good object, it's evil in mode because it's not properly subordinated. This is what the type of temptations are going to happen. So, for example, I guess I'll go with this one because I think a lot of us are going to, although it doesn't strike too close to our hearts, so we can keep it at a distance. It's going to illustrate the principle well. We can look at the wearing of the mantilla, the wearing of the head covering. Now, technically speaking, and I can explain this later. I've explained this like a million times, and people kind of get mad when I explain this. But technically speaking, the wearing of a head covering is something which is of ecclesiastical positive law, and it's in apostolic ecclesiastical. Well, it's in apostolic positive law, but it's nevertheless positive law, so it doesn't change the species of the law. Now, the church with ecclesiastical positive law can dispense with the law in cases where it will bring about sin. So, for example, when we look at the Sunday obligation can actually be dispensed in certain cases where it will lead somebody into sin. A famous instance among the moralists is when we think about like a man who is on his way to Mass every Sunday and passes by the bar and then because this bar is right in front of where his church is, he always gets tempted to drink, and he's an alcoholic, and it leads him into sin. It becomes a proximate occasion for sin. So something like the mantilla actually can bring about a great deal of spiritual pride. So it's something which is it appears to be something which is good. It's presented as something which is good, be based in trad, and at your chapel, wear your mantilla, wear your white lacy mantilla, signify that you're free to the men. But actually, it's something which is quite evil. It's very evil to have pride over a sign of humility, to seek men with a symbol of modesty. It's actually very, very wicked. So yeah, that's I think a perfect example of this principle that St. Thomas is getting at there. Thereby he would, at least in the beginning, turn a man from his chief purpose, and then afterwards it will be easier to induce him to sin once he has turned away ever so little. Then when he has once led men into sin, he so enchains him as to prevent him from rising up of his sin. The devil therefore does two things. He deceives a man first, and then after betraying him, enthralls him in his sin. And then finally, he talks about the world. The world tempts us first by excessive and intemperate desires for the goods of this life, and then second by fear of persecutors and tyrants. And then lastly, he asks, how are we freed from this temptation? And he makes a very interesting note. He notes that actually it doesn't say to ask that we not be tempted, but that we not be led into temptation. Because the trying of our virtue is actually something which is good. You won't get past the purgative way if you're not tried in your virtue, because there's two passive purgations. There's two dark nights: dark night of sense, and then the dark night, two active purgations, two dark nights: the dark night of sense, dark night of spirit. It's going to be some sort of trial that you're going to have to go through in order to advance in the spiritual life. And if you want to read more about this, read St. John of the Cross. He's going to talk about this. And he makes this comment: it is human to be tempted, but to give consent is something which is devilish. So finally, I wanted to read the last paragraph because it's just very good. He says, but does God lead one to evil, that he should pray, lead us not into temptation? I reply that God is said to lead a person into evil by permitting him, to the extent that, because of his many sins, he withdraws his grace from man, and as a result of this withdrawal, man does fall into sin. God, however, directs man by the fervor of charity, that he be not led into temptation. For charity, even in its smallest degree, is able to resist any kind of sin. He also guides man by the light of his intellect, in which he teaches him what he should do. We have this through the gift of understanding. Therefore, when we refuse to consent to temptation, we keep our heart pure. We keep our hearts pure. And it follows from this petition that we are led up to the sight of God, and to it may God lead us all. And then in the final petition, he says he's speaking of evil in general. So we went into the forgiveness of past sins, the freedom from committing future sins. But in this petition 7, he's going to be speaking about evil in general. And he's going to say that God preserves us from this evil in 4 different ways. So first, he preserves us from affliction itself. This is actually he notes this is very rare. Because as I said, the father who is going to afflict his children with punishments is going to be the father that loves his children. And it's the lot of the just in this world to suffer, as we see from Job. So this is going to be very rare, to preserve us from affliction altogether. Second is going to be to deliver us from afflictions when he consoles us. And third is going to be that God bestows so many good things upon those who are afflicted that their evils are forgotten. And then lastly, we are preserved from afflictions in this way, that all temptations and trials are conducive to our own good. We do not pray, deliver us from tribulation, but from evil. This is because tribulations bring a crown to the just, and for that reason, the saints rejoice in their suffering. So from these last 3 petitions, and especially from St. Thomas's fantastic interpretation of them, we really do get a compendium of the teaching of the purgative way in the spiritual life, a teaching of the proper mortification that we ought to engage in. Okay, so next week, as I said, maybe reading the entire exposition of the angelic salutation. It might be the week after. I will definitely let you guys know.